This essay is by a sociology professor named Indra Munshi. She taught at the University of Bombay before she retired. Her works are mainly on the life of Adivasis, tribal studies, sociology and environment, and sociology of tourism. She's written many books like Contradictions in Indian Society and Adivasi Life Stories. So this essay talks about the situation of Adivasis from the colonial times to the present. What has happened to them? How has they fared? How did their life turned out to be since independence? So she calls them ecologically fragile tribes, which means that any upset in their in the forest area or in the geographical area in which they live will directly affect them. For example, if something happens in your town area, if you're living in a town, you can just move to another house in a different part of the town. So but it's not easy for the tribals to do that. Their lives are very much tied to the forest area in which they live. This is the difference. And this essay also looks at what has caused the migration. So in the name of development and progress, many forest areas were taken away from the Adivasis and they were forced to migrate to other places. But it is not easy for the Adivasis to migrate because of their attachment to the place they live. So they have lost their homeland. That is what the title is. They lost their land as well as the livelihood, which means the means to survive. That was also lost. During the colonization time, the Adivasis initially used to live very close to nature. They used to cultivate in the land that they had, but they didn't cultivate every year. In fact, what they have practiced is what is known as shifting cultivation. This means that they will cultivate for 1 or 2 years, then they will leave the land fallow for next 2-3 years. So by this time, the land will regain its fertility very naturally. Then they'll restart cultivating. So this was the practice. What other farmers used to do was they cultivate every year, and the next year the cultivation would be less because the land will have lost its fertility. So what they will do, they'll put artificial manure and pesticides. So the Adivasis did not do that. So the British government needed tax from all kinds of people, including farmers. So from Adivasis they could not get regular income, because after 1 year of income they will not be cultivating, so there is no income, there is nothing to pay taxes. So the British government, what they did, they divided this land and forced these tribal people to start cultivating every year. But what happened was, after 1 or 2 years, the land's fertility will be lost. The soil will not be fertile anymore. So these people, then they did not have any agricultural tools. They did not have any other income. The land would lose its fertility, and because of all kinds of problems, they did not have enough money to give to the British as tax. So there were all these Parsi people. There's a community in India. They used to sell liquor, and they also used to lend money to people at very high interest. So these poor farmers, these tribals, they had to depend on these Parsi liquor sellers to get money to give it to the British people. Now what happened was, this became a very dangerous and exploitative cycle. They won't have enough money. To have money, they will borrow from these people. They will start cultivating. The cultivation always will not result in any proper crops. Sometimes crop failures happen, sometimes you have to borrow more money, they'll become depressed. What will they do? The men will go and buy liquor, which again is sold by the Parsi people. So, and this vicious cycle became very cruel. And what happened was also alienation of land. So imagine that the tribals, when they initially lived, they were very close contact with the land in which they lived. Remember the title of the essay, Laws of Land and Livelihood. Their daily existence depended on the land. They did not exploit the land until the British forced them to do so. Now, these people now, they were completely dependent upon other people. They were living with very average means. They did not have any long-term, plans and all. They lived very modestly, without any luxury, but independently. Now, because of these changes, these tax changes and the Parsi liquor sellers, their independence was completely gone. They were now dependent on the money lenders. They were dependent on the British tax people. They were dependent on the shopkeepers, where they have to borrow provisions for their daily sustenance at a credit. They don't have enough money to pay them, so they were started getting dependent upon people. So they became very frustrated, and they started fighting against and revolting against these money lenders and all. So this happened all over India. If you look at early 20th century, there were many rebellions by the poor farmers against these money lenders and landlords. Even in Kerala, you will find such incidents. So what happened was, from independence, they became very dependent. The Adivasis were independent initially, but because of this exploitation and all, they became very dependent on other people. So what happened was, not only did they have to depend on other people, they also lost their self-respect. So if you have to depend on other people for your daily survival, you might have no respect for yourself. That might happen. Especially for Adivasis, they used to live very close contact with nature, and they did not have to depend on any other people, but now they have to depend on other people who treated them as
this slide
nothing better than slaves.
Questions that you can think about and also do research on. These slides will appear regularly, and you are requested to write down the questions and formulate the answers of all of them together and prepare an assignment based on it.
In this section, there is a long detailed list of how the Adivasi land all over India was taken away by rich people and even the government itself, in order to start a new developmental industrial project. So this has happened in many districts, including Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, and other regions. So the government itself started taking away the lands. This was actually in contravention. This was against the rules that said Adivasi land should belong to them only. They cannot be taken away. But in clear violation of these rules, they started to take away the land and resources of these people. And remember that the forests and the places where Adivasis lived are full of natural resources. So the government started to see an opportunity by removing the people from this land, and started to use this land for industrial and developmental projects. So this was happening in the early independence time, when government started to push for big industrial projects all over India, developmental projects, and industrialization, urbanization was the main goal of the government. Large dams, large industrial complexes, infrastructure, mines and forests were all built in forest areas, and the people who lived there, the tribals, were
removed from there, and this was what happened even after independence. So before independence, the British people exploited them. After independence, the government itself started take this project of exploitation of tribals. You have seen this quotation from International Alliance of Indigenous Tribal Peoples of the Tropical Forest. So Indra Munshi is quoting somebody, and that person is saying the decision to build industries, mines, townships, dams, forest depots were by the government, but it was imposed on the tribal people. They did not have a choice on it. And why was this done? For the economic growth of the country. So the economic growth of the country directly resulted from the exploitation of the tribal people. And when the industry became developed, the economy became developed, who did it benefit? The people who are in the urban, the rich people. So look at what happened. The land of the tribals were taken in the name of progress and development, and the benefit directly went to the rich and powerful people in the cities and the villages. So they not only did not benefit anything from it, they were also exploited. The land was looted, land was exploited, they were thrown away from their place of life and livelihood. So this is what is quoted in that passage. There was a land acquisition bill which was made by the British government. So this was to take away the land of anybody. So when the British moved and the new independent India took charge, what they did was they did not change this law. Instead, they used this land law to acquire land from the tribal people without their permission. So a colonial law was reused by the Indian government to exploit tribals further. So there was no virtually any change from the colonial times to the present times. Exploitation of tribals continued. There is a commissioner for scheduled castes and tribes who regularly produces reports on the state of tribals in the Indian country. So in 1986-87, B.D. Sharma was the commissioner, and he wrote that there was a lot of tension between the poor tribals and the people and the state. So they were fighting with the government because they are losing their land, their property, and they don't have any, they are living in poverty. And many times the tribals who live in the forest are seen as trespassers, which means that they don't even have the rights to live in their own land. In fact, when a government starts an industrial project, these people who live there already are now seen as people who are trespassing on government property. So that is how the government treats tribal people. So there is something else called forest produce. Now forest produce is the things that you can get from the forest for consumption. It could be firewood, it could be some forest material like natural resin, or some other material that you can use for daily consumption. So the tribals
are allowed to collect MFP. MFP is minor forest produce, nothing big. We are not allowed to exploit forest products, but tribals can use them for their own sustenance and livelihood. Even that is now taken away from the tribals. Another commissioner who was the commissioner in 2001 to 2, he said in many areas uh, agriculture by tribals have declined. All over India agriculture has increased, but among the tribals this has decreased. So tribals do not have enough materials and technology to sustain agriculture in a large scale way. They don't have enough land. Some have land, but it's very less. They don't have enough land to make a proper profit or anything. So what they do, they have to now migrate to other areas and other cities, because they lack employment in their own area. They have to now move to the city. And many public companies, even public companies and even private companies, continue to exploit these tribals, and this has led to the impoverishment of tribals. They became now in poverty ridden state. And it's clear that many industries and projects are coming up in tribal areas, because these areas are forest areas which are full of natural resources. So naturally all these these companies will try to make their industries and companies in such areas. So they have to evacuate all the tribals there. Around 9 million to 20 million people are displaced in India, and about 40% of them are tribals. In India, in various industrial projects, many people are displaced, and among these 40% of them are tribals. So this is the commissioner of tribal aspects, talking about their state. So one report was 1986, another report from 2001, but you can see that nothing much has changed. Their poverty has increased. They are become unemployed. They don't have enough employment in their own area. They have to move to the cities, and even in cities they are not getting any good jobs. They have to look for very unskilled labor force. They become part of the unskilled labor force and starts to live in fringe areas of urban cities like slum areas. So this is their fate. While the rest of the country progresses in the name of using forests and tribal areas, the tribals themselves become impoverished, and they live in poverty, and they become miserable. When big industries and companies continued to exploit the forests, the natural resource of the forest became depleted. So people who use these resources, the tribals, are unable to meet their needs, their daily needs. This is especially bad for the women in tribal areas, who have to meet the fuel, water, food, fodder requirements of the family and its cattle. They have to meet these requirements from the forest, but the forest has become the forest is now lacking natural all these resources because of the exploitation of companies. Now they have to struggle harder, and many Adivasis are forced to migrate to rural areas or urban areas in search of work. They are what is called footloose workers. Now footloose workers are people who does not have a proper job, who has to shift from one job to another. So such workers does not have any security or protection. They don't know when they will get they won't get enough payment. They'll be exploited. So all these things can happen to footloose workers. They are unorganized. They don't have a trade union or something. They simply shift from one job to another because they are unskilled laborers. And in the northeast tribal belt, which means places in the northeast area of India, like Nagaland, Manipur, Assam, all those areas, the tribal situation is different from central and southern India. So tribals there are different from the tribals in these areas. They did not have much immigration in colonial days, but now even there things are changing. The tribals are a majority in Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Mizoram, and Meghalaya. So they are not facing the kind of exploitation that tribals in other areas are experiencing. For example, somebody who is living in Jharkhand or in Andhra Pradesh, tribals there are facing exploitation of land and such resources. But tribals in Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Mizoram, and Meghalaya, they are also tribals, but they don't have the same kind of exploitation that happens in other parts of India, central India and southern India. So in the early 90s, the Indian government adopted the policy of globalization and liberalization, which means opening the market further so that foreign companies also can come and invest in India and start their offices here. So this has actually accelerated the exploitation of tribals. The government also did something more. They opened more scheduled areas for investment. So big companies were allowed to come into these forest areas, which were actually scheduled areas. Scheduled means scheduled is actually we are talking about the Constitution of India, in which some areas were scheduled areas, which means they are protected areas which cannot be exploited. But now the government is taking those places also, forgetting that they are scheduled areas, and transfer of tribal land to companies are happening. So big companies are now starting in tribal areas. So a lot of tension is happening across India. For example, the Indian Tobacco Company in Andhra Pradesh, the Jindals, they are a big business family in India. They are doing business in Chhattisgarh in tribal area. The Sahara Housing Limited has acquired land in Maharashtra. So all these areas, remember, they are areas of the tribal people. They are now being opened to big companies. So they will come and exploit this land. The tribals will be thrown away, and this land will be taken up by the government and these companies. So government is also helping these companies and exploiting the tribals. Another big threat that happens in tribal areas is of mining companies. So mining companies and mines and quarries are where metal resources are being mined and taken for industry. So in many areas of India, mines and quarries are started by big companies, and Adivasis are evicted from these places. This has happened in Chhattisgarh and other areas of India. Chhattisgarh, a lot of people are tribals. Almost 31% of all Chhattisgarh people are Adivasis, and many clashes are happening between Adivasis and police in many regions. They have very poor very poor nutritional and education and health. Malnutrition is very high in such areas, and big companies like Tata are acquired land in these areas to start building steel plants and other companies. One particular case they mention is about the steel plant planned by the Tatas. The Tata company is starting a steel plant in 2000 hectares that actually belong to 10 villages in Lohandigooda, which is a 5th scheduled area, which means that it's a tribal area, nobody should enter there, but the government has completely disregarded it and started giving this land to the Tatas. This was in clear violation of the provisions of the panchayats. So there is a PESA Act in 1996 which gives autonomy to the panchayats to rule themselves, but the central government violated these rules and started to give this land to the Tata company. We can also see that this area is especially important because this is the only area in which this particular culture of Maria Gond, it's a tribal culture. These people are nowhere else in India, so they only survive in that area, so their culture and civilization will be completely lost. Also, wild buffaloes are there, they are particular to that region, they will also be now go extinct if the company is built there. So what happened was, there was a Panchayat Act which said that these areas should be governed by the Panchayat themselves, but the government has completely disregarded it, and Adivasis were thrown out, the culture was lost, wild buffaloes were started to become extinct. So this is what is happening in many areas in India, and this is just an example of such a thing. This came out in the report of the Center for Science and Environment in 2008. The loss of land in the Lohandiguda region. So across India, while tribal areas are being taken away by private companies, we must not forget that the government is also helping these private companies to exploit the tribals. Now the tribals are not sitting idle, they are starting to resist. They are also reaffirming their rights, their tribal self. They want to recapture the lands that were taken away from them. So a kind of militancy is happening among tribals. So this is what you hear as a militancy. So militancy are armed groups who fight against the government. Don't confuse it with military. Military is the government forces who protect the state from foreign and other forces. Militants are actually armed Maoists who fights against the governments. So E.A.S. Sharma, former Commissioner of Tribal Welfare, he says that I do not believe in violence by anybody because I believe in democracy, but left extremism, this is what is called the Maoists and Naxalites in tribal areas, that is only a secondary issue. The primary issue is that many of these private companies as well as police and military and even the government itself is exploiting the tribals, taking away their land, their property as well as their right to live in that place. So the constitution has upheld the rights of the tribals, but the government has completely disregarded it and going on their own way to exploit the tribals. So if the government live by the spirit of the constitution, if you look at the constitution has provided enough measures to support the tribals, and if every government starts to listen to the constitution and live by that constitution, rule by that constitution, then there will not be any tribal discontent, which means that the tribal militancy will go down. They will cooperate with the rest of the state, the rest of the government, but they should not be exploited. The militancy, the Naxalites come only because the government is exploiting the tribals.
Please remember that these slides are for your assignment, so keep noting down points so that you can answer them and compile them into one assignment that you have to submit.
Look at the two issues there. There are many welfare schemes for tribals. Some tribals have benefited from it. The other issue is that many tribal young men and women, they don't want to do their tribal occupations. They want to move to the city and pursue modern education and modern employment. So these two problems are there. The author argues that it should be a choice, that the tribal people should have a choice in whether they want to live in their forest areas or whether they want to go to the city. It should not be forced on them. This is what the author is arguing. If you look at the last several decades, many tribals are in on the move, which means they are constantly moving from one place to another. For industrial projects, for displacement, they are totally removed from their area of uh, their native place, and they are moving across different regions of the country for want of jobs and survival. Now, the question of resettlement. Suppose a tribal is displaced from his area of living, then he is resettled in a new place. So this new place, what happens is that many tribals are intimately tied with their land of survival. Their livelihood is tied up to the land in which they lived. Now when they are resettled for a government project or industrial project, they move to a new area where they don't know the place, they don't know what occupations they can do to survive. It is completely inhospitable and foreign to them. So what many people then want is to go back to their original native place and live there. So then the question comes, why is this displacement there? But many times it is not the choice of the tribals. They are simply displaced, they are resettled somewhere else, and this has happened several times across the country for the past several decades. In the case of India, even though we say that we are a democracy, it is a democracy that usually favors the rich and the powerful. The poor tribals are never featuring in this democratic means. An important step that happened to correct the historic wrong and restoring the rights of the Adivasis has been the bill known as the Scheduled Tribes Recognition of Forest Rights Bill, which came in 2005. So this bill gave the rights to Adivasis to manage forest areas in which they live. So they have the rights to manage things there. So this was a good move to resettle or to restore the rights of the forest people or the Adivasis. So they will have a say, they have a choice in what is happening in the forest. So when a government or an industrial project comes to that place, they will have to first talk to the tribals, convince them, and then start the project only with the consent of the tribal people. If they say no, the project will not happen. So they will have a say in the things that happen in those areas. But the problem is that this bill was never properly implemented. It was a good bill which the government has passed, but the bill was never properly implemented for the benefit of the tribal. So the tribal benefit still did not happen, even though the bill was passed at the governmental level. We reach the end of the essay, and the author is now talking about one final problem that is affecting the Adivasis. It is the exploitation of Adivasi women or land rights. So many Adivasi women might be contributing more to their families than their men, but the land rights usually go to the men. So she is giving example of two such incidents among tribals across India. One is the Ho woman, that in these are tribals in um, Jharkhand area, and there they don't have any land rights or property rights, even though their contribution to the family is much more than the men. Another is the Santals of Bihar, in which they have started a movement to give land rights to women. Even the men are supporting that movement. So these are two instances in which the uh, rights of Adivasi women are also highlighted. This is an issue which is usually not addressed when talking about Adivasi issues. So there are further exploitation within Adivasis. So that also should be taken account of. And the Indra Munshi talks about an incident about an Adivasi woman who was widowed in her youth, and her in-laws were trying to throw her out. So she had to now fight against the in-laws. But the way the fight is going on, it is not for her own rights that she can fight for, but her sons. So the son has some her son will have some right over the marital property, the property of that son's father or the uh, wife's husband who died, and only when she asks for the son's right that she can gather some support from her other community. If she asks for her own rights, she will not get any support, but if she asks for her son's right to the property, she will get some support from the community. So these are all various complicated issues that are discussed in the essay Laws of Land and Livelihood by Indra Munshi. She has done extensive research on various issues faced by the tribals across India, and she brings out instances where tribals are exploited not only by rich people or powerful people, but even by the government itself. She also talks about tribal militancy, armed groups within tribals who fight against the government. How did they arise? What is their reason? And various government policies that frequently leads to exploitation. She ends the essay with the note on how Adivasi women are also to be their rights are also to be addressed. So this is the major aspects that are of the Adivasi life in India presently that are discussed in this essay, Laws of Land and Livelihood by Indra Munshi.